Well, we've been in our Simple Gospel series for over a year now, and we're starting to come down the home stretch. And what I mean by that is that with each passing week, we're getting a better and better picture, a more clearer picture of what the gospel or the good news is. So the good news, according to Jesus, is that the kingdom of God has come near, which means that the heaven reality and the earth reality are coming together through the work that he is doing. So the heaven reality, the full realization of God's perfect reign, and earth, the reality where sin has captured our hearts and kind of continues to captivate us and dominate us, those two environments are coming together through the work that Jesus is about to do. But how exactly is this going to happen? And that's kind of what's unfolding. According to Luke, through some very specific events. One of the events is called the Incarnation, also known as the birth of Jesus. This incredible event where God wraps himself in human flesh. He becomes a human. God becomes a human and lives among us. Okay, that's the first event. The second event is that he will suffer and die. He'll suffer and die. The third event is that he will resurrect from the dead. And that's why we sing a song like Mystery. Christ has died. Christ has risen. These are two pivotal historical events that our faith is utterly dependent upon. As I've said many times, these are all-in kinds of beliefs because if they're true, then we must accept, and everyone must accept, that Jesus is in fact the King of the world. And we must submit our whole lives to him if they're true. And if they're not true, we must reject Jesus as a fraud and a lunatic and go home. Stark contrast, right? But there is no middle ground. Jesus does not afford us that opportunity to find a middle ground. These are the pivot points in your life. Has Christ come into the world to redeem it, to set things right? Has he suffered and died? And has he resurrected? So, while two of those events have not happened yet, in Luke, he does continue to look forward to those. Having all kinds of trouble with my paper here. He does continue to look forward to these. And he's going to do that here in Luke chapter 12, although as I first read it, you might think, well, what in the world? That doesn't seem like he's pointing to those. So, it's kind of a strange text, which we've been in this section now of Luke where there's several of those. So just bear with it. Be dressed for action and have your lamps lit. Be like those who are waiting for their master to return from the wedding banquet so that they may open the door for him as soon as he comes and knocks. Blessed are those slaves whom the master finds alert when he comes. Truly I tell you, he will fasten his belt and have them sit down and eat, and he will come and serve them. If he comes during the middle of the night or near dawn and finds them so, blessed are those slaves. But know this, if the owner of the house had known at what hour the thief was coming, he would not have let his house be broken into. You also must be ready, for the Son of Man is coming at an unexpected hour. And Peter said, Lord, are you telling this parable for us or for everyone? And the Lord said, who then is the faithful and prudent manager whom his master will put in charge of his slaves to give them their allowance of food at the proper time? Blessed is that slave whom his master will find at work when he arrives. Truly I tell you, he will put that one in charge of all his possessions. But if that slave says to himself, my master is delayed, I added the my master is delayed in coming, and if he begins to beat the other slaves, men and women, and to eat and drink and get drunk, the master of that slave will come on a day when he does not expect him, and at an hour that he does not know, and he will cut him into pieces, which is nice, and put him with the unfaithful. That slave who knew what his master wanted, but did not prepare himself or do what was wanted, will receive a severe beating. But the one who did not know and did what deserved a beating will receive a light beating. From everyone to whom much has been given, much will be required. And from the one to whom much has been entrusted, even more will be demanded. I came to bring fire to the earth, and how I wish it were already kindled. I have a baptism with which to be baptized, and what stress I am under until it is completed. Do you think that I have come to bring peace to the earth? No, I tell you, but rather division. From now on, 5 in one household will be divided, 3 against 2 and 2 against 3. So they will be divided, father against son and son against father, mother against daughter and daughter against mother, mother-in-law against her daughter-in-law. That's nothing new, Jesus. And daughter-in-law against mother-in-law. He also said to the crowds, when you see a cloud rising in the west, you immediately say, it's going to rain, and so it happens. And when you see the south blowing wind, you say, there will be a scorching heat, and it happens. You hypocrites, you know how to interpret the appearance of earth and sky, but why do you not know how to interpret the present time? Right. So there's a few different parables and images that Jesus uses here, but I'm not going to dissect them because sometimes the parables of Jesus are best left kind of just as they're told. And I think this is one of those cases. Instead of digging into these parables and the particular images, what I'm going to do is kind of extract a few themes that are present throughout them. And they are summarized in these 3 words: urgency, alertness, and fidelity. Now, I mentioned that Jesus is looking forward to those 2 pivotal events that I talked about. This section is about whether or not the first century Jews were alert enough to recognize what was happening through the ministry of Jesus, that Jesus is the one they had been waiting for. So there's some indications here that Jesus' language is reminiscent of the Passover in Exodus. You might know that story, you might not. I'll kind of briefly tell it to you. The Israelites were slaves in Egypt, and they cry out to God, and God sends Moses to deliver them from Egypt. And Pharaoh, the leader of Egypt, kind of keeps saying, no, you can't go. And God keeps sending plagues. Well, the last plague, the final plague, is this really, really difficult to swallow plague where God sends something called the destroyer, or the death angel, to pass over Egypt and kill the firstborn child in every home. Firstborn son in every home. And the Israelites can be exempt from this if they follow these instructions. If they take a lamb, an innocent lamb, and they kill it, and they put the blood on the doorposts. See, it's a kind of an interesting story, right? Well, this happens, and the destroyer comes, and he passes over, and everyone who has blood on their doorpost is passed over, right? But whoever doesn't, the destroyer enters in, and the firstborn child in every Egypt is dead the next morning. Firstborn son in every home is dead. Well, this is a real sobering experience, right, for the Egyptians, but it's also sobering for the Israelites. So imagine this, that they're sitting in their houses in full awareness of the events that are coming. They're gathered around a table. They're fully dressed and ready to leave at a moment's notice. They have, their instructions were to have their loins girded, which we don't say, but that means to have your belt wrapped to pull up your robe so that you can run swiftly, right? So you can be quick to action with your feet. That's your loins girded. You're ready for action. So they're sitting there in their houses. They're ready for action, ready to move at a moment's notice. Their hearts are pounding. They're sober-minded. They're waiting the destroyer to come, maybe hoping, I hope Moses relayed the instructions correctly, right? Maybe thinking, I hope I heard the instructions correctly and implemented them correctly, because this destroyer thing is a pretty big deal, right? This is the kind of urgency that Jesus has in mind here. See, Jesus is going to become, through those 2 events that I talked about, he's going to become the Passover lamb, and he's going to become the firstborn son. Not just once a year, not just one night, but once and for all, he will become it. And he's going to initiate a new exodus, a new deliverance, whereas people were delivered from the slavery of sin and death. But they must be dressed and ready for action, alert for that moment. So Peter's feeling a little uncomfortable maybe with these parables. And he says, so Jesus, is this for us or is this for everybody else that's listening? What's going on here? And so that kind of gives us a glimpse into the context So apparently Jesus is talking to his disciples, and there are other people around, crowds. Maybe the Pharisees are still there. People are listening in, and Jesus is saying these things, and Peter's like, who's this for? Is this for us or for somebody else? And Jesus, in complete Jesus-like fashion, does not answer the question. He doesn't even reference it. We don't know if he looked at Peter, if he gave him some kind of nod or indication, but he just starts telling another story, another parable. And this parable is about faithfulness. It's about fidelity. It's about a servant living in accordance to the master's will while he is away. Jesus, as he comes onto the scene in the first century, is looking for those who are faithful. And he has chosen these disciples who are with him. The question is, will they remain faithful in the midst of all that's going to happen? Because there's going to be some trying times. Will they be faithful with the truth that they have been entrusted with? Because it's going to be tested. And we know that, in fact, that does play out. They are tested. Then Jesus finishes with this really interesting thing, right? Where he says, hey, I didn't come to bring peace. I came to bring division. You're like, well, wait a minute, Kevin. I just heard you, like 5 weeks ago, preach a sermon about how Jesus came to bring peace. So you were wrong. Well, what is happening? What is Jesus talking about here? Well, what he's saying is that the reality of this truth, the reality of his ministry, is that his death and resurrection will serve as a sword. It will divide households, and here's how. Because you'll have some members of the household who are all in on this truth about the death and the resurrection of Jesus, therefore making him the king over all things and worthy of being submitted to their whole lives. And you'll have other members of the family who say, no, he's a fraud. He's a lunatic. And they'll continue on in their life like nothing ever happened. That's why I call these all-in truths. You can't believe them halfway. There is no middle ground. Either Jesus did suffer and die, and he was resurrected, or he didn't. There is no middle ground. Then there's a warning. He says, look, you guys, you can look at the weather, the events that are happening, and you can kind of predict the future weather. But yet, you can't see what's happening right in front of you. N.T. Wright says it like this. He says, the crisis is coming. Jesus sees then that the crisis is coming, a crisis of which his own fate will be the central feature. That's the baptism by which he must undergo. And he is astonished and dismayed that so few of his contemporaries can see it at all. They're good at local weather forecasts, clouds rolling in from the Mediterranean, mean rain, and a wind from the hot and dusty Negev means sultry weather. So why can't they look at what's going on all around them, from the Roman occupation to the oppressive regime of Herod, from the wealthy and arrogant high priests in Jerusalem to the false agendas of the Pharisees, and in the middle of it all, a young prophet announcing God's kingdom and healing the sick? Why can't they put two and two together and realize that this is the moment all Israel's history has been waiting for? Why can't they see that the crisis is coming? If they could, they would be well advised to take action while there was still time. You guys can predict the weather, but you're unaware of what's unfolding right in front of you, Jesus says. So what does this mean for us? Well, I mentioned the lyrics that we just sang right before this a moment ago. The song's called Mystery. I said Christ has died and Christ has risen, but I left off the third line. The song doesn't end there. There's a third line in the chorus which says, Christ will come again. Christ has died, Christ has risen, Christ will come again. This is another pivotal belief that Christians have, which is that Jesus will come back to earth a second time. All the beliefs around this are in a group of studies called eschatology, which means a study of the end. And there's all kinds of beliefs about eschatology. If you have been around church for any period of time, you probably have some idea about the end kind of built into your theology. I'll give you kind of a brief synopsis of 3 major beliefs, and I know that I'm oversimplifying these, if there are any students of these out there. The predominant Christian belief 200 years ago was about the end was that the world was getting better. It was constantly moving towards wholeness as the kingdom spread throughout the earth through the work of the church. That's a function of belief called postmillennialism. Then came World War I and World War II, where it seemed that the whole world was falling apart, was breaking apart at the seams. And so over the past 80 years, the predominant Christian belief is that the world is getting worse and worse. It's descending more and more into chaos. And it'll eventually get so bad that Jesus will come back. That's a function of a belief about the end called premillennialism. And still there are others who have insisted all along that there's always going to be good and evil mixed together, with no side really gaining the advantage until the end comes. There's an ebb and flow. Sometimes it'll seem real bad. Sometimes it'll seem really good. But there's a mixture, and it's just always going to be that way until Jesus comes back to make all things right. And that's a function of a belief called amillennialism. There are other aspects of this. I mean, there's entire books written about each of those beliefs, and there's kind of things stemmed off from those beliefs. And you might be sitting here thinking, I don't understand why you're telling us this. I'm bored. What are you talking about? Well, the reason I mention that is because I think that it's important to understand that our view of the end is important because it shapes how we live. What you believe about the beginning and what you believe about the ending has a major impact on how you live in the middle. And here we are in the middle. And things are not as they should be. Things are broken, right? Stories on the news remind us of this every day. You get notifications on your phone, you get on a website, maybe you still read a newspaper, and you're reminded every day, man, things are messed up. Things are not the way that they're supposed to be. And then you come here, and we're always talking about the kingdom of God. And we're always talking about the goodness of God. And we're always talking about how Jesus comes to bring hope and reconciliation and freedom and shalom. And maybe it doesn't feel like it's adding up on some days. And we're like, I don't see it. I don't see it happening. It doesn't feel like God is winning. So what do we cling to in the midst of that? What do we cling to when we wake up in the morning and we read the news and we just put our hand on our head and we just realize this is a day just like all the others where it seems like everything is spinning out of control? What do we do in the midst of that? Well, there's a few truths that we can cling to. I think that as Jesus is talking to his disciples here about their place in the first century, I think he's also talking to us about our place as we await his second coming. And here's some truth. First, there is certainty in his coming. Jesus is coming to set things right. He will bring heaven and earth together once and for all, and he will destroy the enemies of humanity, the enemies of himself. There is certainty in his coming, but there is uncertainty in his timing. There's uncertainty in his timing. Paul would borrow this thief imagery, and he would use it about the second coming. He would say that Jesus will come like a thief in the night. When you least expect it, he will come. So there is certainty that Jesus is coming again. There's uncertainty in his timing. And what we do in the space between his going away and his coming back matters deeply. I've thought about this, and if I got to speak just to the whole American church, what would I say? And if I had assurance that there was a foundation of the gospel and understanding of the kingdom kind of built in, which, by the way, I don't, but if I had that assurance, here's what I would say. I would say, what you do now, between the time that Jesus ascends into heaven, he's sitting at the right hand of the Father, sends his Spirit. What you do now, in the time between that and his second coming, matters deeply. It matters deeply. What should we do? What should we do in that space, in the middle? Well, first we should be alert. We should be alert. Keep our eyes open. See the world through the kingdom goggles that Jesus has given us. And that's through the Spirit. The Spirit opens our eyes. He enables us to see the reality of what's truly happening. He allows us to see things as they truly are. So be alert. Be alert. Peter says, I think it's Peter, that Satan is walking around, the enemy of God, is walking around like a roaring lion, seeking someone to devour. And so he says, be alert, be sober-minded. Be alert, be sober-minded. It's the first thing. The second thing is be faithful. Be faithful. Lindsay and I just celebrated our 10-year anniversary. And so I was thinking about this, our wedding day, and as you do on anniversaries. And just imagining the church as the bride of Christ as they are described in the New Testament, as we are described in the New Testament. We are the bride of Christ. And so it is imperative that in the engagement that we have, that ring that we have on our finger that says we're getting married, we're bound to that ring to live according to this engagement that we have. But the wedding hasn't happened yet. The wedding is going to happen, and it's going to be a beautiful wedding. We're going to present ourselves pure and spotless before our God and King. Be faithful in the time in between his going away, coming back. As we look forward to that day when all things are set right, we stand firmly in the promise that Jesus is coming back a second time. And this, my friends, is also an all-in truth, which means you either believe it or you don't believe it. Either Jesus is coming back or he's not. Kevin, you're so profound. Right? Either Jesus is coming back or he's not coming back. Either you believe that in your heart or you do not believe that. So what if Jesus isn't coming back? I mean, have you thought about this? Maybe you question this. Maybe you wrestle with this. This is one of those things that in my conversations with people, they do have a hard time with. Have a hard time with the resurrection of Jesus. Have a hard time with the ascension of Jesus. They have a hard time with the second coming of Jesus, right? These are things that people have questions about, doubts about. I will tell you, if you do not believe in the second coming, there is nothing to believe in. If Jesus isn't coming back, we're toast. And I could probably use a stronger word because it's that bleak. If Jesus is not coming back, we are all left to wander recklessly in our own devices, and there is no hope, there is no future. There's no reason to live. There's no reason to spend our lives doing anything, basically. There is no hope if Jesus is not coming back. So this is an all-in truth. You either believe it or you don't. This is not one of those things that you can set aside. Okay? Jesus is coming back. The last words of the Bible, the end of the Bible, is the author of Revelation saying, Jesus, come quickly. Lord, come quickly. I wanted to read to you Revelation 21, which is a picture of that day that we are looking forward to, and then we're going to sing a song about it. Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and the sea was no more. And I saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, "See, the home of God is among mortals. He will dwell with them. They will be his peoples, and God himself will be with them. He will wipe every tear from their eyes. Death will be no more. Mourning and crying and pain will be no more, for the first things have passed away." And the one who was seated on the throne said, "See, I am making all things new." And that's the day that we are looking forward to.